what are cancer rates near nuclear plants? Before we came around 30 years ago, if you look through the medical literature, there was almost nothing written in medical journals addressing this, again, very, very basic question. There's something in public health called the precautionary principle, which basically says that if you are going to produce some sort of a product that may be harmful, the burden of proof that it is safe is on you. What the nuclear industry did was they declared it safe based on no studies, no evidence, and turned it over to people with concerns like our group and said, okay, you prove it that it's harmful. No, from the beginning the proof should have been on them, but then we wouldn't have had nuclear power plants because people would have known how harmful it is to human health.
You are listening to TMI for the week of June 11th, 2018.
This week I'm joined by Joe Mangano from the Radiation and Public Health Project, RPHP. Joe is a health researcher who has served with RPHP since 1989. Joe Mangano is author or co-author of 33 medical journal articles on radiation health. His books, Low-Level Radiation and Immune System Damage, An Atomic Era Legacy, Radioactive Baby Teeth, The Cancer Link, and Mad Science, The Nuclear Power Experiment, with foreword by Alec Baldwin. His website, www.radiation.org. One of the things about being bombarded with too much information in our society is this sort of fragmentation into groups that don't cross over into each other. So,
I'm sort of a jack of all trades, master of none. I mean, the whole nuclear issue, part of it is health, part of it is physics, part of it is history, part of it is current events. So
and economics.
Economics,
ethics,
so
geopolitics, military.
Yes. Oh, right,
all
yes,
that.
yes,
yeah.
Yes. So I try to cover a different a variety of different areas.
Mm-hmm.
Even though my training is in health, of course, you have to recognize what we're working in, the fishbowl we're working in. So go ahead, lay it on me.
What made you pursue a career in environmentally related science?
Well, it really is several steps. The way I got into public health was I was influenced by my parents, a physician and a nurse, and I was working in hospitals and in government, in health. The second step came back in 1989, where I was reading one of my father's medical journals. There was an article by these two gentlemen, Jay Gould and Ernest Sternglass, one a statistician and one a physicist, about Chernobyl and not just what the health hazards were in the former Soviet Union, but in the United States, because the fallout came all the way around the globe. And this is the late 80s. This was a time where a number of new diseases were seen to be cropping up or increasing, and especially affecting the baby boom generation, who then were in their 30s or so. Things like the AIDS epidemic came out of nowhere. Breast cancer in young and middle-aged women was rapidly rising. Chronic fatigue syndrome, there's a number of them. And these two guys made the point that this age group was being hit especially hard. And I thought, you know what? I think they may have something. And something in me caused me to pick up the phone. And thus, in 1989, I joined this group, the Radiation and Public Health Project, which is a group whose mission is to do research on disease rates near nuclear plants and to educate the public and leaders about it.
So somebody had already suspected that there was a connection between all these plants. And atmospheric testing,
yes.
perhaps.
Oh, well, this goes back. Nuclear power runs on uranium atoms, okay, where you smash the atom and create high heat, which converts to electricity. It's the same process as when an atomic bomb explodes, all right, which was the first use of the atom, as we know, the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II, and following up the very disturbing nuclear arms race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the 1950s and early 60s. Nuclear power, as a way to make electricity, was really and truly a matter of the government trying to persuade people not to worry too much about the atom, even though a lot of people were very worried about a nuclear war, and a lot of leaders on both sides were predicting that it was inevitable. They wanted to show us that, hey, nuclear weapons are bad, but there's other uses of the atom. We could use it for medical purposes. We could use it to make electricity, which was quite true. However, what they left out of the sales pitch was the health hazards. When you run a nuclear reactor, there's three major worries. Number one, the big one, and that is, can we guarantee there will be no major meltdowns? And of course the answer is no. We've seen several: 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, Chernobyl. Number two, can we be certain that the portion of radiation that is not stored but escapes from the reactors, which it must do, will not harm people? Of course, that was known then, because no matter how low a dose, this is poison and it's going to harm people. And number three is, what do we do with the enormous amount of highly radioactive waste that is left over from the process of making electricity, but must be stored for hundreds and thousands of years away from humans? And to this point, we still do not have a permanent repository, and this is 60 years after.
I notice in Texas and New Mexico, there's a big push to create a parking lot for wastes of all kinds, military and from nuclear power plants. This must, I mean, and it always seems to affect indigenous minorities and classes of people that don't benefit, obviously, from the process.
Right. The one that the government has had their eyes on as a permanent waste repository is Yucca Mountain, which is in the state of Nevada, very close to where they tested atomic bombs years ago. The only reason it hasn't gone further is political reasons. Harry Reid was the head of the minority leader of the Senate for a number of years. He's from the state of Nevada. Of course, he persuaded President Obama to stop the funding to build this repository. Obama's out of office, and now Donald Trump is in, and of course, Trump is throwing more money at it. We really don't know what's going to happen to the waste long term. We didn't know 60 years ago. We still don't know now.
What is RPHP working on currently?
Our work, for the most part, has, over the last 30 years, has essentially been to document the answer to the very, very basic question: what are cancer rates near nuclear plants? Before we came around 30 years ago, if you look through the medical literature, there was almost nothing written in medical journals addressing this, again, very, very basic question. Was it a coincidence? Of course. The party line among the government and the industry was, well, as long as the reactor releases below a certain amount of radiation, And as long as the levels in the water and the air and the soil are below a certain level, we consider that permissible limits and therefore safe. Well, when I went to public health school, and any good public health school would teach you that you can't make that jump. You can't make that assumptions. You got to do the studies first. But that was not the deal with nuclear reactors. In fact, there were a few brave scientists that tried publishing, and they suffered some very severe professional consequences. You know, their grants were taken away, and they lost their jobs as in universities, things like that. The government didn't want to, and to this day, again, 60 plus years since the first U.S. reactor started, there has only been one study by the federal government on cancer near nukes, which was done in the late 80s, and it was only done because Senator Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, forced the National Cancer Institute to do it. Since then, they've ignored the issue.
You would think that one of the things limiting the progress of nuclear power is the lack of trust amongst people. The answer would be to have an epidemiological study at every single nuclear plant proving how wonderful and fabulous it is. But we haven't seen that.
No, we haven't, and I've sort of, and my colleagues have worn ourselves out whenever we get criticized for the studies we do, and we inevitably do from industry and government. We pose the question, tell me what evidence there is, numerical, data-based evidence, that nuclear plants are safe, that cancer rates are not above, what's expected, what's normal, okay? And there we are met with silence because there is no such evidence.
I'm reading that you are uncovering some alarming information about living close to nuclear power plants.
Well, yes, we have. And by they are alarming, but we like to think of them also as informative as well. I mean, this is part of nuclear power. This is not, again, we're talking about atomic bombs that produce electricity here. This is a serious health issue. We've published 37 articles in medical journals over the years, and these are what we call peer-reviewed. It's not just us writing a report and posting it on the web. No, they have to go to a journal. The journal reviews them. The reviewers are unknown to us, and they say, okay, this is not good enough to publish, or yes, it is good enough to publish. And we've done 37 of them.
Wow. And that's a lot of that is available on your website.
And a lot of it's all available on the website, radiation.org. What have we found would take me a long time to explain, but if I can generalize, first of all, we find in many cases when a nuclear plant begins, we see an immediate increase in local rates of disease and death among babies and children, infant mortality, premature births, underweight births, and cancers diagnosed in young children. They are sort of the canary birds. A dose of radiation is going to affect a fetus or an infant far, far more than that same dose would affect an adult. Everyone is affected, but far more.
Well, that right there is a very interesting point, because the cells in a baby are the ancestors for future cells to start off with.
That is correct, and they are also, as you know, duplicating very rapidly.
Right.
The rate of growth in a fetus is incredibly fast. At 3 months, the fetus is the size of a lima bean, and at 9 months, it's 7 pounds on average. As a child, the growth rate is fast. Adults do not grow like that. So if you damage an adult cell, it's going to duplicate to other damaged cells, but slower. But if you damage a fetal cell or an infant cell, it's going to replicate very fast. And this is nothing we made up. This is something that all scientists are completely in agreement on. The fight begins when the issue is raised, but is it causing more infants to die and premature births and more young people with cancer? That's the main thing. To add a little lighter end to it, we have done studies of nuclear plants that have closed, and we find just the opposite. When a nuclear plant closes, in our studies looked at 8 reactors. In the first 2 years, the infant death rate plunged in the county or 2 counties closest to the plant, and the cancer rate in children 4 years of age or under plunged as well. Long term, we've published an article finding that the cancer rate among all people, including adults, declines as well. We did a study at the reactor called Rancho Seco. It's near Sacramento, California. It's a highly populated area. And we estimated that the decline meant that 4,300 fewer people died of cancer in a 20-year period. We've also, if I can continue, maybe the thing that drew the most attention, nobody has ever looked at how much radiation is in bodies of people who live near nuclear plants. Again, a very basic question. We conducted a study. It wasn't a brand new idea. It had been done before during the period of atomic bomb tests that we called the Tooth Fairy Project.
Right.
Which sounds like a fun little game for kids, but it's really a serious scientific study.
This is the most incredible thing I think I've ever heard.
I'm glad, because I wanted to spend a little time on it.
Please do.
To collect human samples usually is difficult. Usually means an autopsy or a biopsy or urine sample or blood sample. The easiest way to do it is when children's baby teeth fall out, which they do naturally, to just have the parents send them in and test the teeth for a particular chemical. 100 chemicals or more are created when you run a nuclear reactor. One of them is called strontium-90. Strontium chemically is a lot like calcium. When you ingest it, it goes right for the bone. It goes into the stomach and then the blood and into the bone quickly. In the case of calcium, of course, that's something that, enhances health. However, strontium, the radioactive form of strontium, is the opposite. It is a unstable atom that damages and kills cells, and even gets into the bone marrow, where the white and red blood cells, which are the immune system's army, are there and attacks them. Strontium-90 was known in the early 60s and the late 50s during the bomb test era. During the protests against the bomb, there were signs, please get the strontium-90 out of my kid's milk. And so on. Anyway, we took those 5,000 teeth and we sent each of them to a laboratory, and we had them tested for the strontium-90 concentration. We found 3 things. Number 1, the strontium level in the counties closest to nuclear reactors were about 50% higher than those far from reactors. Number 2, we found as time went on, in the 80s and the 90s, the average levels went up by like 40%. This is near 6 different nuclear plants. And finally, we found that near several plants, if you could imagine a graph with 2 lines, one is the trend in strontium-90, one is the trend in child cancer. The 2 lines are the same. When strontium-90 goes up, childhood cancer goes up. When strontium-90 goes down, childhood cancer goes down. And we published the findings in 5 peer-reviewed medical journal articles. And to this day, this is the only study that has ever looked at, how much radiation is in the bodies of people living near nuclear plants.
Wow.
In the U.S.
Also, isn't it also true that they found strontium-90 in teeth as a result of atmospheric testing? So it's in everybody's teeth. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's where we got the idea. Again, it wasn't a new idea. Back in the late 1950s,
Yeah.
citizens and scientists in St. Louis got together and said, you know what? We got to stop this bomb testing, and we got to find out. We're going to show how much is actually getting in kids' bodies. So they did this. I think it's one of the great scientific efforts of the 20th century.
Yeah.
They collected 320,000 baby teeth, mostly from St. Louis, but from other areas, and including other countries like Canada. And they showed as the testing went on, the levels got higher and higher. And it was presented to Congress in 1963, right before the treaty banning above-ground testing was signed by President Kennedy and Chairman Khrushchev. So yes, they found that this strontium-90 does come from atomic tests. However, once the treaty was signed, the next 5 years the levels plunged in half. It went down 50%. That was the early to the late 60s. So by the time we came around in the late 80s and 90s, pretty much a lot of the strontium-90 had gone. And when we're finding that, in the present, levels were rising, that couldn't be bomb test fallout. Right. I mean, they haven't tested, above the ground in over 50 years. That was exactly the response we got from the industry and from government. No, this is not from reactors. It's from bomb tests. Well, if it's from bomb tests, why are the levels going up? Why are they hiring in nuclear plants? Mm-hmm. Again, something that was never addressed. We're very proud of this study and continue to use it.
Kind of out of curiosity, we need one now to track what's happened since some of these large nuclear accidents.
I think we do.
Yeah.
I think we do. I think there should have been a 2 study near Chernobyl. I think there should be one near Fukushima. There is some discussion about it. It's a difficult thing to do, very costly, but and it takes a lot of citizen help to collect the teeth. However, I think it should be done. And again, in the U.S. and Canada and other places, the reactors are getting older. They're getting more corroded. They're leaking more. Yet the people that own them are dragging their heels about shutting down. Some are shutting, but not at a fast enough rate. So I would definitely agree that another one like that is needed.
One of the words that's used a lot when we're talking about this, and I don't find helpful, is radiation. Because radiation can so easily be used to confuse. It's really, I think it's better to talk about it as a chemical pollutant. And that because that reminds us that we're talking about particles as being the real threat. I mean, radiation, in that radiation be divided over the whole body, whereas these particles come into actual direct contact with tissues. This is a different ballgame. And am I correct in assuming that, the modeling is based on radiation, and there's very little of the modeling is based on direct tissue contact with a man-made fission product? Would that be accurate?
Yeah, you've raised a good point, and maybe I should backpedal a little bit. We use the term radiation a lot, but radiation is not just one thing. There are various types of radiation. There's natural radiation in the ground and in the air. Different chemicals such as radon. Okay, they have been around for millions of years. All right, they are harmful, of course. All radiation is harmful, but again, they are part of the human ecology and have been so for a long time. There's also medical radiation. A simple X-ray or a CAT scan and so on give off radioactive waves. in order to diagnose disease and even to treat disease as well. Then there is the radiation that we deal with, also known as fission products. And that, again, sorry to go back to the history lesson again. This fissioning was only first discovered in the 1940s. What you do is by taking a uranium-235 atom, which is radioactive, and bombarding it with neutrons. It's a little technical talk, but you split the uranium-235 atom. Okay, and what does that do? Well, without going into a whole physics lesson here, it does two things. Number one, it creates high energy and high heat. And number two, it produces over 100 chemicals, radioactive chemicals, that are not found in nature. You see, what we've done in the last 7 years is added to the natural radiation these chemicals like strontium-90, iodine-131, cesium-137, plutonium-239. Each of them are radioactive, which means they're unstable, and each of them are harmful to human beings, to plants, and to animals. Okay, each one of them does something different. Like I explained before, strontium-90 is like calcium, and it seeks out the bone and the bone marrow. Iodine goes right for the thyroid gland, which is a little gland. It's like a butterfly. It's wrapped around the throat. Very, very important for human physical and mental growth. Cesium-137 goes all across the soft tissues in the body, and so on. This is the big concern. These are I forget what word you used. I like to use the word poisons, because that's what it is. They don't serve any useful purpose in our ecology and in our bodies. All they do is harm and destroy cells, okay? And they are made by humans. And the worst thing about it is each of them decays. Any radioactive chemical decays. Some decay very fast. Some are gone within days. Others take longer, dozens of years, hundreds of years, thousands of years, some of them. And it's all a concern. But what we've done is added this crop of poisons to our environment for a very, very long time.
A chemical pollutant poison here in Canada we're worried about is tritium. Our nuclear reactors make 100 times the tritium as a comparable U.S. PWR reactor. And then we dump this tritium by licensed agreement, and we don't warn the public. The public can't mitigate their exposure. And then when you talk to nuclear proponents about it, it's this harmless substance. They minimize the health impacts of it. The problem, as I think you'll point out, is that we breathe it, we drink it. It could be steam, it could be water, it could be in our air. Whatever the concentration we find tritium as in our environment winds up being the concentration of tritium in our bodies.
Yes.
You speak to why we shouldn't be listening to people minimize the health effects of tritium.
Because they have no proof that it doesn't harm people, right? There's something in public health called the precautionary principle,
right?
Which basically says that if you are going to produce some sort of a product that may be harmful, the burden of proof that it is safe is on you. What the nuclear industry did was they declared it safe based on no studies, no evidence, and turned it over to people with concerns like our group and said, okay, you prove it that it's harmful. No, from the beginning, the proof should have been on them. but then we wouldn't have had nuclear power plants because people would have known how harmful it is to human health.
I remember being quite young reading articles that were pro-nuclear, even one in Reader's Digest. And it was one buzzword that was repeated over and over and over again, and I assume it was the sort of promise of nuclear, and that's the idea of containment. And what we've seen time after time is that this idea of containment is a fallacy.
That's right. That was one of the big promises of the 1950s. Don't you worry now. Atomic bombs are bad, but nuclear power is completely safe. We keep it in the reactors, and there will never be any leaks and so on. No, to run a reactor, you must release a portion of it. Otherwise, you don't create electricity. All right, just to simplify it. Then when it comes time to store it, you have to build storage facilities that will keep it away from human contact for hundreds, thousands of years. The way we've been storing radioactive waste for the last 60 years, for the most part, are these very deep pools of water. Okay, and these 10-foot long, they look like 10-foot long pencils. They're called fuel rods that are full of radiation, and they're red hot, are placed into this water, which must be constantly cooled. And if it's not cooled, such as Fukushima, they had that tsunami and they lost their water, there's going to be a meltdown. The leaders thought that there was going to be another place, a permanent place like Nevada, to put these long pencils, these long rods. And since that has been, pushed back, they kept putting more and more and more of these rods into the pools until they were overwhelmed with them. Now, in more recent years, they're starting to move some of them into what they call dry casks, these big concrete and steel casks that, without any water, that hold these rods. Transferring the rods is a risk. And number two, remember the rods are still hot. They're like 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And three, even though they're steel and concrete, they are placed out of doors. They sit on the grounds around nuclear plants. Okay, and in this age of terrorism especially, this makes for a very great concern about whether we can safeguard these for long periods of time.
Have you taken much interest in this plan up here in Canada to create a deep geological repository on the shore of Lake Huron?
I know something about it. Once again, these plans, such as the one you mentioned, have come up repeatedly over the years. But, and I'll leave this one to the geologists, there always is some sort of concern, right? Like water, some sort of slip up that could, like water seeping in, through the ground and so on.
Well, that's exactly what was brought up at the hearings. They had quite a few well-accredited geologists talking about the nature of the dirt they were going to be shafting through, that there is a pocket below it with a very high hydrostatic pressure that would create a 10-meter head at the surface. It's just unbelievable. Or that,
and the water gets in, and it turns to steam, and the steam rises and then gets out into the air. All right, and then we start breathing it, and it gets into our food and water.
Let me list a few more things. There's
ahead.
going to be another session of glacial gouging. So you might be burying it 600 meters deep now, but what will it be after the next period of gouging? There's an ongoing tritium contamination event wherein some wells tested on the Bruce site have concentrations of 50,000 becquerels per liter in well tested. So you're going to be shafting through a nuclear accident, bringing all those tailings to the surface, and you're dealing with runoff. It goes on and on and on. In the brochure wherein they promote this repository, it's explained right in the first paragraph that the canisters won't survive the hydrostatic pressure of the local rock and will be crushed as part of what's expected to happen. So, I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, and I mean, the idea that we're trying to do something that will last for hundreds and thousands of years is just ludicrous, especially with these, very, poisonous, very, very harmful chemicals and the huge amounts in there, But again, these decisions were made at a time when the political will was to try to make, ease people's minds about the idea of nuclear war, to really distract them, right? And but these we never addressed because there are no answers. Let's face it.
Find us on Twitter @thatarcher, our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Rate the show on iTunes. It changes the way the show is listed.
Well, here's another thing. Incineration. Now,
oh, yes.
Now, I'm aware of a couple of the incinerators up here where we burn, like with flames. It's not very high tech. Our nuclear waste, the low level nuclear waste, but either way. And you sound like you're maybe, making a mountain out of a molehill, but our own regulator releases the concentrations of radioactive particles in the effluent from these incinerators. And then I read just the other day that we're sending some of our spent nuclear product to the United States, where you guys are incinerating some of it for us.
I believe to South Carolina, yes, to is it Barnwell or Savannah River? Yeah, that's right.
So my question is, could we make a map of incinerators in the United States?
We certainly can.
Can you?
I'm sure it's been done before.
So this is a common practice.
No, not at all. Not at all. This is a lot of this is done by government regulators, right? And they to the best of their abilities, they choose to make this something that the public doesn't really know about.
Mm-hmm.
And it's they can get away with it because radiation is this type of radiation is invisible. You don't see it. You can't smell it. You can't hear it. It's not like an atomic bomb or anything. People just it's possible to put one over on people, except for the people who live near it, and who of course are often very alarmed. But that doesn't reduce the seriousness of what we're talking about, not just for today, but for many years to come. Our focus has been to try to do something about the reactors still running. You know what? We have a massive amount of this waste, but let's get reactors closed so that we stop producing any more of it. All right, let's try to, I shouldn't say minimize, but limit how much we produce.
Well, to do that, we need public will, and let me paint a picture for you. In Ontario, we have some 20 nuclear reactors, maybe two of them close, 20 nuclear reactors. The province to our right and our left, no reactors. In fact, there's no running reactors in any other province other than in New Brunswick, where there's one running. And Canadians probably think of themselves as a nuclear nation. And here in Ontario, as I said, there's 20. We are across the lake from a bunch. One of them is a sister to the Fukushima nuclear plant. In Lake Erie, it's just dotted with nuclear plants. So for an Ontarian, and then you've got the history of mining, the temporary and permanent waste storage locations, fabrication plant right here in downtown Toronto. Essentially, in absolutely every direction, we are surrounded by them. And my point is, if you ask an Ontarian how many nuclear power plants in Ontario, they'd probably say 3.
Mm-hmm.
How many nuclear reactors in Ontario?
That's right. They see it on the highway, like, oh yeah, there's a plant, or there's some, or don't even see, recognize it. Oh, there's some big building there. That's what it looks like, a building. It's not a bomb. It's not anything like a fire or anything like that.
But they've I want to know how much they've spent to make sure that no matter what, nobody has a clue of anything related to nuclear here in Ontario. And yet, I wonder if we're one of the most nuclearized regions in the world.
That is a very good point, and although I haven't studied it, I would put that up as one of the most nuclearized areas. Yeah. No question about it. The plants are, none of them are far away from populations. All right, they try to be at least, if not in the middle of the big city, at least relatively close, so the electric company can get the electricity fairly easily to buildings and homes. Think of where the population in Canada. It's kind of focused,
Yep.
And that's where nuclear reactors are.
An example is Pickering, where if you argue that it's too close to a population center, maybe when it was built, it had probably the population was still too close to the city. But since then, the population has just skyrocketed around it, and there's residential right up to the fence. It's literally, not only was it too close to a population center, but a new population center has risen up around it with no limits or controls or concern.
Also something that was ignored by the original designers. Like, what this may be a rural area now, but what's it going to be like in 50 years, in 2018? No, nobody cared. They just went ahead with it.
How close is Indian Point to New York City?
That's the of the many examples, that's probably the most disturbing. New York City, of course, is 8.5 million people. There is a plant exactly 35 miles away from the Midtown Manhattan. It's called Indian Point. It's got 3 reactors. One was closed back in the 70s. It was a small one, but there are 2 large ones that opened in the mid-70s. They're old now and corroding, and they're terrorist targets. One of the planes flew on 9/11, flew right over them. And they are continuing to pump out these radioactive poisons. And of course, at the time, I wouldn't say it was a rural area, but it was the population right near that plant, within a few miles, has grown rapidly. The suburbanites who often commute to New York. That is a deep concern, and right now there is a battle going on to get it shut down. There's an agreement between the industry and the government to shut it within 3 years, but there's a lot of concern that the industry is going to try to jump down the trap door and persuade officials to allow them to run beyond that. And then, of course, there's the waste. This is a great example of the waste. Okay, you've got 50 years of waste laying around. Okay, what could happen? If we never find a permanent spot, it's going to be there forever. That's not good. And if we do transfer it, it's what people call mobile Chernobyl. It's on the Indian Point is on the Hudson River. Every nuclear plant's on a body of water. You're going to take that waste in these casks. You're going to place them on barges, float them down the Hudson River about, I think 40 miles or so, slowly to a spot in New Jersey, where then they will be placed on trucks and trains. And again, the idea here is to have that permanent storage site in Nevada, which is 2,500 miles away. I mean, just think of, and it's not just like one trip. This is going to take 20 years of going back and forth and back and forth. It's really a game of roulette here. And I'm just talking about one plant. And if you have one breakdown where, the casks, don't hold up and radiation escapes, you're going to have, what's the equivalent of a meltdown. And in a place like the New York City area, there's no way in God's name you can safely evacuate people in time before they're irradiated.
Isn't this what sort of a kid does, before he's learned some of these life lessons? Is, you keep, putting your dirty socks or something in the closet, and you wind up with a problem that just gets bigger and bigger and more embarrassing and more embarrassing. I mean, it just seems to defy any...
Well, I look at it two ways, and I hope the listeners aren't too despondent by this. Yes, the problem is getting bigger and bigger, more and more waste, reactors going longer. However, let's look back. Could it have been worse? It could have been much worse. Number one, the bomb test, the above-ground bomb test, again, were banned in 1963. A professor from University of Arizona recently made an estimate. No one's really tried it, and it's very hard to do. How many lives were saved by taking those tests underground and now gone forever? He estimated between 12 and 24 million U.S. lives alone were saved. Let's take another example. In 1974, this is when Richard Nixon was president, his aides, the Atomic Energy Commission, predicted that by the 21st century, the U.S. was going to have 1,200 nuclear reactors.
Yeah.
Okay, and what happened is by the 1970s, the people that financed nuclear plants, the Wall Street people, said, "Whoa, wait a minute. We've been financing these plants, and you want more. You keep telling us it's going to cost, $50 million, and it winds up $700 million, and we have all these dangers. Chernobyl has exploded, and 3 Mile Island had a meltdown. No, we're not going to do it anymore." So, in the U.S. at least, we never got beyond 100. I think 28 reactors at one time was the highest. Now we're down to 99. We're going to still go down, and I can quote I think it was a senior vice president of Exelon, which is a company based in Chicago. They are the largest operator of nuclear plants in the U.S. The senior VP said there will never be another new reactor built in the United States ever. All right, so that's not from us. That's from the folks that want more. So in some ways it's a sad story. In other ways, we have prevented things from getting worse. And of course, the idea that we've avoided nuclear war to this point, although there's still an option, is kind of a miracle. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the world came very, very close to a large-scale nuclear war until Kennedy and Khrushchev said, "You know what, this isn't going to work." All right. So, but there we go. This is something that we must continue to work on.
Well, that reminds me of another sort of incredible thing. As there's been very few examples of just forget nuclear war, but just traditional war in a war theater that contains nuclear power plants. And I mean, that almost sort of happened in Ukraine when there was unrest there. But you've got nuclear power plants in a war theater. It's I can't even.
Yes, and we're all worried about North Korea, and they've exploded eight bombs, I believe, and I don't know how many they have. I don't think anyone knows, but it's small. The former Soviet Union, which, as you said, has gone through some political upheavals, and they still have 7,000 nuclear weapons at the ready, as does the United States. It only takes like 100 essentially to really end life as we know it on this planet. So we've come a long way. The numbers used to be much higher, but we can't rest now. There's more to go.
Leave it to me to rain on your parade of positivity, but we're trying to export nuclear power plants to places like Jordan and Saudi Arabia and a whole host of countries that how do we know they quickly won't fall out of our, quote, sphere of influence, unquote, or return to being sort of military hotspots. And then there will be these nuclear power plants in war theaters. And so I often refer to them as they're self-installed landmines.
That's correct. Yeah, I would say self-installed atomic bombs, but yes, we're talking about the same thing. Remember, there's a lot of talk by the industry, a lot of ideas being thrown out. Oh, we have a new idea for nuclear reactors, what's the chemical that they were going to use?
Thorium.
Instead of uranium. Thorium, thank you. Well, they've been talking about thorium reactors for a long time. You know what? It's still sitting on some guy's desk, on his drawing board, with this outline. Okay.
The Indian government started their thorium research in the 50s, and surely there's been enough time for a commercial model, even.
Yeah. They do this to keep their public image positive, but the reality is, and I have to say that even though I'm a health professional, and I'd like to say that the progress has been limited because of health concerns, it's really been an economic issue, especially now that many of these reactors in operation are getting much older, and they have to be secured, in this age of terrorism, and their parts break down more easily and need to be maintained. Not only are they more dangerous, but they're also more expensive.
Yeah.
Even for years they mocked solar power and wind power. Oh my God, it's so expensive. It'll never happen. Well, guess what? Here we are in 2018, and in a number of countries, solar and wind are less expensive than nuclear power, and certainly have none of the health risks.
And they're building wind and solar as we speak.
Right. You look at countries like Germany and oh dear, I think it's Spain and Denmark. They're rapidly moving towards a safe, renewable energy portfolio.
Some of these countries, including Canada and Ontario, have feed-in tariff and micro-FIT incentives for people to put solar on their roofs and wind on farms and stuff. Is there a big push for that in the United States?
There has been, yes. There's been, for I think about a decade, there has been, not just by the federal government, but in different states, there have been incentives for businesses or individuals to install solar power and wind power. With the Trump administration in power, now the federal monies have slowed somewhat, but there's no question that the momentum has been building and building. They're still behind, renewable. They're still behind nuclear. They're still behind coal. They're still behind natural gas. But the change is becoming rapid, and it's now kind of urgent that we keep this momentum going, because as the U.S. goes, so goes many countries in the world.
Just in the last couple of days, Trump has come out and declared support for coal and nuclear bailouts.
Yeah.
How do you background all of these concerns and this momentum in a direction we've been going in against this totally unpredictable government?
They're just trying to sell a product that has been, no one's buying it. Again, the heads of the biggest nuclear company in the U.S. said no more new nukes. They're never going to be built. Yet they're still out there, sort of talking the talk. I guess they have to do it because, much like cigarettes, years ago the cigarette companies knew that they were going to sell fewer.
Yeah.
Down the line. They knew people were going to stop smoking because the public health efforts to not smoke or to quit smoking was on the way. But they did everything in their power just to stretch it out as long as they could, They began selling to third world countries, and they developed these what do you call those cigarettes? The smoke-free cigarettes.
Yeah. The vapes.
Things like, just like that. So just to stretch it out. I like to say, like, the war is over, but they haven't come out with their hands up yet. They still think there's going to be a nuclear future, but it's really a delusion. But the unfortunate part is, while they stretch it out, more people are suffering. More people are exposed to these poisons. More people are going to develop cancer and birth defects and so on. That's the unfortunate part.
How worried about SMRs are you?
Yet another. You want to tell the audience what SMR is?
Small modular reactors.
Small modular. Yes.
I'm trying to punch up to the audience here.
Yes, this is one of the many ideas.
Yeah.
By the nuclear people, just to kind of keep their product fresh. Yeah, they, like in a place like Alaska, they're putting a few of these small, or I think they're proposing to put a few of these small reactors in these very rural, very isolated towns. And they have these small reactors like in submarines as it is, which is another headache, because you could easily have a meltdown. Yeah. When you're underwater, and then the fallout gets into the ocean, much like the fallout from Fukushima is still going into the Pacific. It's an idea. These companies spend a lot of money on research and development, and they're constantly trying to grab for new straws. But I'm not going to say don't worry about it, but the people that have funded them and financed it, both government and Wall Street, really haven't been buying for a long, long time.
One sort of issue with them is that if these giant, absolutely enormous 50-ton reactors aren't profitable in the long run, how is it SMR going to have economic efficiency? What was the term I'm looking for? Economy of scale.
Yeah. Again, usually when you come up with an idea, you test a model out, right? Okay, we're going to have a hybrid car, buy a hybrid car. But, the Japanese first went out and made these, and they tested them out. And look, these cars are getting much better gas mileage, and they run very well. These are ideas that are just not tested. They just say, well, please give us the money to do this. But again, even the pro-nuclear government and Wall Street, which at one time was very pro-nuclear, they're looking at other things, including solar and wind power. I'm pleased to say.
And nothing will change in terms of the nuclear liability law. These SMRs they won't have a containment that's going to keep an aircraft out. That, if proposed, if they got their way and there were lots of SMRs, we'd have nuclear waste trucks driving down Main Street.
Yes.
In a climate where nobody's liable.
Where nobody's liable. Yep. Yeah, and I haven't brought up Price Anderson because I know your audience is well aware of Price Anderson, but very, very simply, if it wasn't for that was the original government bailout, there wouldn't be any nuclear reactors. No insurance company would write a policy in case of a meltdown. They were stuck, and the government bailed them out.
Can you think of another?
On taxpayers.
There must be a bunch of pieces of legislation that, in a sense, underpin nuclear policy. The Price-Anderson Act's sort of an obvious one, but there's probably a whole bunch of them. Probably the charter under which the NRC was formed would be a starting place.
Yeah, the Atomic Energy Act was the very first one. When Dwight Eisenhower became president, he went to the UN. He made the speech, again, addressing the fears of nuclear war and saying, we have atoms for peace, okay? And we can do things like use them for medical purposes and make electricity and so on. So the Atomic Energy Act was rapidly passed. And, that's still in effect. And it really funded a lot of the development of these reactors. It was taxpayer money. It wasn't just a company going in. They would the work had all been done. The designs were made, and engineers have been trained and so on. On on doing government reactors, and they just sort of pawned off them. So,
is this accurate? My take on the history of the legislation is that the Atomic Energy Act ran until 1974, in where that's when the NRC was formed. And am I reading too much into that? Wasn't it that the AEC was sort of dissolved because of regulatory capture? It had been so taken over by this blind policy to pursue nuclear that there was no objectivity.
That's right.
So,
on paper, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so, but this brings me to regulatory capture. I mean, it's obviously an issue here in Canada where our regulator is housed in the same ministry that is essentially responsible for exporting uranium. So what could go wrong there? In Japan, there was all kinds of, once they realized there was regulatory capture there, they dissolved NISA and formed what they call the NRA. In the United States, regulatory capture can be, I guess, seen by observing some of these hearings that are made public. What role are these hearings in the grander scheme? Is it just theater, or can these hearings lead to, public impact on public policy?
It's all theater because, I'm not going to say I support the nuclear companies. No, they are producing a poison and they're lying about it. However, they're private companies, right? I have nothing against free enterprise and private enterprise. It is the real key here is the role of the government regulators. Okay, fine. You can Exelon and these other companies can build all the reactors they want, but it is up to the officials who we elect and who the elected officials appoint to keep our environment safe and to protect our health. And groups like the AEC and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and even the National Cancer Institute, National Institute of Health in the U.S., are simply not doing it. That disturbs me because this is my chosen field. I was taught that public health people are to, prevent disease and to protect human health. No, they are a complete lackey of this very strong industry, which funds elections very, very heavily and lobbies heavily once people are in office, and they completely turned a blind eye to health for the last 60 years. And that's where the problem lies. Sure, they're going to try to build nuclear reactors and keep them running. They're a business. They're trying to make money. But many of whom are medical doctors and people with public health degrees and so on. Yep.
I was concerned recently because a Canadian scientist was testing the beach on the coast of BC, facing the Pacific, and showing contamination, but his overall message was, see nothing to worry here. And I'm thinking to myself, well, the only people who probably are handing out money for his work are probably the nuclear industry. And universities take huge amounts of money from industry, especially in Western Canada. And probably whole wings of the university are built by some of these companies that mine and produce for the industry. Okay, so here's this scientist, and he's taking his soil samples, and he's telling us how safe the low levels are. But there's fission products on the beach. Lost in the whole message is, here's man-made fission products on the beach.
Mm-hmm.
For
years we looked at the Soviet Union as the bad guy. They're lying to their people. They're spewing propaganda about things such as their nuclear plants. We did the same thing here in the United States. I'm sorry to say, even though this is a democracy and we have a structure for people to be protected. The politics of the Cold War and then after overpowered that mandate of government to protect people. But it's up to ordinary citizens and groups like independent groups like ours to make sure that this doesn't go any farther.
How can people learn more about what your organization is doing, Radiation and Public Health Project?
Please go to our website. It's www.radiation.org, and you will see a variety of our work, our journal articles, the books that we've done, information on the press conferences we've done, 29 of those, op-eds in newspapers, and so forth. It's not just science. Much of it is written in very very legible language for people to understand.
Okay, and some of those publications that you write for, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists,
yes,
Counterpunch, Common Dreams, Huffington Post,
yep,
Washington
and even
Spectator.
coverage that we've had from publications including USA Today, the New York Times, the Washington Post, plus much local coverage, but even national coverage.
You've made reference to a couple books that you've written.
Yeah, we've done 8.
And you yourself have a couple.
And I've done 3 of those 8. Yeah.
What are your 3?
Well, the 3 books I've done. The first one was essentially a study of the baby boomers and how they did a lot worse health-wise than their parents. The Great Depression generation. The second one was a very readable book, short book on the baby tooth study. Full of not just science but anecdotes and information from media. And the final one was a book called Mad Science that came out 5 years ago, and that was really sort of a quick review and a look at where we're going with the nuclear power industry.
And the full title of that was Mad Science, the Nuclear Power Experiment.
That's correct.
The other one, Low-Level Radiation and Immune System Damage.
That's right.
And the baby tooth one is...
It was called Radioactive Baby Teeth, the Cancer Link.
Yeah.
It's available on Amazon.
And so when we go to your website, we're seeing books, we're seeing articles, we're seeing essays. But I noticed Alec Baldwin is quite interested in nuclear.
We have 2 very high-profile figures who have, for a long time, 20 years now, supported us with their time and with their efforts to appeal to citizens. One is Alec Baldwin, the actor, and one is Christy Brinkley, the model. We're very delighted to have them. They are very loyal people. They understand the seriousness of this issue, and yet they continue to pursue it despite their busy schedules.
I can't believe more celebrities don't, and I'm thinking that their managers and agents tell them to stay out of hot water.
This is a hot water thing. You don't do this to become popular, all right? Because they have taken a lot of heat too. The slogan, "This is just science by celebrity." Which is all the more reason they should be credited for the work they've done. No, it is a hot button issue, but they understand the seriousness of it.
Well, I can't thank you enough for your time. Thanks for speaking to me. Maybe you'll speak to me again. I'd really like to do a show about 3 Mile Island.
I can do an hour on that.
Okay.
I can do an hour on a lot of things, but
right.
I'm glad we had this time.
That was Joe Mangano from the Radiation and Public Health Project, RPHP. It is a non-profit educational and scientific group making public the effects of nuclear radiation on public health. Their website, www.radiation.org. I spoke with Joe Mangano by phone from New York.
Find us on Twitter, @thatarcher. Send us an email, archer@twxnet.com. For guest links and contact info, visit our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Find us on Android and Apple Podcast apps. Subscribe and rate the show on iTunes.
I'm Dave Archer in Toronto.
And I'm Joe Mangano in New Jersey.